Hey guys, happy Easter. This month I plan to publish a video about nationalism, the script of which is finished, but unfortunately I won't have time to record and edit it before April. Still, I wanted to make a short video to meet my New Year's resolution of one video per month this year. Now, before you accuse me of a lack of industriousness, I did manage to complete my other New Year's resolution, getting through Capital Volume 1, something I really never thought I'd do. Capital is an incredibly enlightening work, and I'm planning on doing a long-form breakdown summary of it on this channel, more for my own clarification than anything else. But in the meantime, I thought it would be cool to give my immediate thoughts on finishing it 3 days ago. First, for being a 1,000-page tome, it's not nearly as difficult as I was expecting it. Originally, I had planned to stretch out the reading over 8 months, corresponding to the 8 sections, but honestly, once it gets going, it's really easy to get sucked into it. A lot of people are put off from reading Capital by how dry it starts, but I can honestly say that that's a mistake. The first chapter in particular does contain long, dry passages droning on about 12 coats of linen and 40 pounds of corn and 7 tons of iron, etc., but most of the rest of the book isn't like that. Marx actually changes writing styles relatively frequently, and I think he basically shifts between 4 distinct styles: accountant, machine god mysticism, historian, and investigative journalists. So if you're bored out of your mind reading charts and numbers, just keep reading. It's only a matter of time before he writes about something very specific and much more interesting, like war or anecdotes of children who've died in factories. The final part of Capital is especially nice, as it's almost entirely history and is therefore much easier to read and much more enjoyable than the first chapter. It's like a cherry at the end of it all. It's also easier to get through if you view the larger chapters as small hills to surmount. The most difficult chapters are the first chapter, the third, the 10th, the 15th, and the 25th. Reading and comprehending these constitute small but manageable projects. All the other chapters are relatively short and easy to get through. Conceptualizing the book like this made it much easier to get through because it's much less intimidating to deal with a multitude of small problems than one big problem. And actually, that applies to most things. Hegel's influence is very clear, especially as you go back and examine his argumentative structure, but I think it's very interesting that thesis, antithesis, synthesis, as far as I can tell, is nowhere in Capital. Marx is not interested in contradictory ideas flying in at each other. What does come up again and again is the relation between quality and quantity. This relation is seen, for example, in the combination of use value, which is qualitative, and value, which is quantitative. In chapter 11, he explicitly references Hegel to speak about this point, stating, "Here, as in natural science, is shown the correctness of the law discovered by Hegel, that a merely quantitative difference beyond a certain point passes into qualitative change." Personally, I think this is a much cooler way of looking at dialectics than thesis, antithesis, synthesis, because it can better explain development. The idea of quantities growing is natural, and it's not a stretch to point out that at a certain point, quantity passes over into quality. This is probably misleading, but I think this is a good way of thinking about higher mathematics, for example. All of calculus is just extrapolation on the real numbers, but by the time you're doing calculus with those numbers, really you're grappling with qualitative concepts. In the same way, feudalism develops quantitatively, eventually taking on a qualitative nature which undermines it, giving way to capitalism. Marx also uses the term dialectical inversion a lot, which is an incredibly interesting concept. I don't totally understand it, but I think it's something like when the flip side of an idea subsumes the original idea. For example, Marx talks about the process of money being continually exchanged for commodities and vice versa. In this process, he identifies the CMC chain. The inversion of the CMC chain is the MCM chain. These are fundamentally the same idea. Really, it's just a different way of looking at the same process, but at the same time, they're different in very important ways. All this is to say, Hegel's ghost is very present in Capital. I don't think you need to read Hegel to read Capital, but you should at least know of Hegel. Marx is also clearly influenced by Adam Smith, who I will recommend reading before reading Capital, simply because Adam Smith is much easier to read than Hegel, and very worthwhile in my opinion. While we're on the topic of prerequisites, you should at least read the Communist Manifesto first. This should not be the first piece you read by Marx. The manifesto also makes up for a common criticism of Capital, which is that Capital has almost nothing to say about communism. It's a book about the inner workings of capitalism. A broader annoyance that I personally have with Marx is it's kind of difficult to find his explicit plans for a communist society. However, in a way, reading Capital kind of makes up for this because by understanding capitalism on the fundamental level Marx sets out for, you begin to wonder about what society would look like if these economic tendencies weren't the case. And I call them tendencies, not laws, because Marx revealed them to be just that. So, in a kind of roundabout way, Capital guides you to an idea of communism by identifying the elements of capitalism and forcing you to realize that things don't have to be this way. For example, the first part of Capital is concerned with the commodity form. Once you understand the commodity form, you can start to wonder about possible modes of production without the commodity form, and thus you develop a conception of a socialist society kind of by negative reasoning. This has the advantage or disadvantage of being extremely open-ended, but thus is the nature of great works of philosophy. I also think it's fair to say that pretty much all of Capital is just Marx extrapolating on the labor theory of value. Maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see. If you've been a fan of my channel for a while, you might be noticing a pattern. The idea that value is not price, but rather accumulated human labor, is the foundation of the entire book. It's not an accident that he starts on this point, and it clearly paves the way for the rest of the book. For example, by the time he gets to machines in chapter 10, it's very easy to see that machinery reduces the value of commodities by reducing the human labor required to produce them. Sorry if I sound like a broken record. While doing research for the nationalism video, I stumbled onto certain so-called Marxists who tried to combine Marx with marginal utility theory, which is just insane to me. To combine Marx with marginalism is to miss the point of Capital entirely, but that's a topic for a different video. Another thing, I initially got into anti-capitalism after learning about the idea of stolen surplus value. The idea that when you work, you produce a certain amount of value, but you're only given a percentage of it, the remaining part is taken by your employer. This is an important point, and it's how a lot of people explain capitalism, but this is also kind of misleading. Capitalism is supposed to be a distinct system, but surplus value theft also occurred under feudalism, where lords would take a cut from their serfs. So for a while, I was kind of confused about the exact difference between capitalism and feudalism. Marx is very helpful here, because he explains that capitalism is not just the practice of stealing surplus value, it's the production of self-valorizing value. This is a very important point that he talks a lot about in Capital, and I'll explain it better when I do a more in-depth analysis, but basically, under feudalism, production was naturally limited by the desires of the feudal lords. However, under capitalism, we've reached a point where capital kind of perpetuates itself. This is important because when you get down to it, the bourgeoisie aren't really even the villains here, because really, capitalists are acting not of their own accord, but on behalf of capital itself. They have to, because if they don't, they'll be taken over by other capitalists who do. In feudalism, your ruler really was the evil oppressing you, but by the time we reach capitalism, the economy has started spinning out of control. It's become its own self-perpetuating, self-sustaining chain reaction, not reducible to any one evil individual. It's a process, not a conspiracy. Not that there aren't evil capitalists, but to focus on them would be to miss the capital acting behind them. I have other thoughts, but I think I've said enough to get people upset at me. These are just some things I've been thinking about since finishing it 3 days ago. Eventually, I'll make a series of videos going over Capital in much greater detail. Probably 8 videos for the 8 individual parts, but I'd like to read it again first, while taking closer notes. That might sound tiresome, but really something as special as Capital deserves to be read twice. Thank you, and happy Easter.